Okay, we'll make a start. Welcome back, everybody, safely this time. Probably won't be next time. We've averted two catastrophes this week, so there should be cause for some celebration somewhere. Not bad. You have your final project and must be wildly excited by that. Those of you who are interested in such things will actually know that for the first time ever, I got my slides out this morning in advance. I've never done that before. Of course, I had to go back and change them. But I'm incredibly proud of that. That's after being nagged by several people. Do that for yourself. The projects, as I hope you've begun to look at, are designed to try to sort of tack between what you're doing in, shall we say, your main studio areas or main program areas and this course. They've been shown, they were discussed heavily by all the TAs here, and they've also been discussed through David Jamer and Susan. So they're all, that project is, I think people see it as kind of really kind of combining the two parts of your, shall we say, kind of graduate education, the creative and the analytical. I am looking forward to reading everything. Next week, Carlo Di Salvo from Georgia Tech on the kind of basically the politics, what he calls adversarial design, agnonism, which is confrontation in a way. And to some extent, Carl, a little bit like the lecture that we are missing here, the ghost lecture at the moment, Jonah's lecture last week, dealing with how to engage with technologies, systems, networks. Carl will pick up a lot of the kind of issues, more perhaps at a sort of larger political scale than Jonah would. I'm still trying to wonder how to fit Jonah's talk somehow into the weeks we have left. I'm not sure how to do that, but I would like you to be able to get Jonah's talk. What we're doing today is the critical in design, and it's fundamentally 3 case studies, Balogun, Boeing, Berlin, simply because I like the alliteration. None of them are 21st century designs. Balogun dates back from 1940, you'll discover Boeing and Berlin, both from the 1990s. But I think they offer, again, perspectives on the critical, and I've also deliberately, because of Jonah's lecture and because of Carl Di Salvo's lecture, who were both focusing on absolutely contemporary technological projects, I wanted to focus on other kinds of projects. So trying to show you, to some extent, the projects, especially the first 2 of those 2, are not overtly critical in a sort of BC way, but I want to look at how things can be critical without necessarily being overtly critical, which I think is a deep condition of design. There's masses of slides, there's over 150, so this will be a long lecture, but at least most of them are visual, relatively. But let me begin with actually Jonah's ghost lecture, which is to say 4 points from his lecture which he didn't give, but which he did give, if you see what I mean, last year. And which, when I heard Jonah talk, I think Jonah has extraordinary ability, given, I think, much from his scientific, technological background, to be one condition is his ability to define the analytic context in which he's working. He defined and articulated remarkably clearly the issues that were dealt with in each project. It's one of the absolute joys of listening to Jonah talk. And I've said here, and this is a kind of reminder for you, that this is much more unusual than it should be. Part of the challenge of the final project is for you to become equally articulate in definition. And I tell you, that's essential. I was talking to a second-year design and technology student about her thesis 2 weeks ago. A thesis is, I think, potentially extremely interesting. Her inability to become articulate and definitional about what she might do, I think will probably blow her thesis. I mean, it's that serious. I don't think there are some kinds of work you can do without being able to be. So I think this is an important condition. You just have to take on board. Secondly, something we've talked about for a long time, which is the intertwining of thinking and technology through the apparatus, thinking things both ways. So thinking things analytically, and then thinking analysis through things, thinking how things challenge this. And I just put in this wonderful little image of one of Jonah's friends. Literally a breadboard, of course. Thirdly, Jonah made a great point, and I thought this was, again, relates back to the LUD, reconfiguration to create new relationships. He said, used this term 2 or 3 times in his lecture, reconfiguring rule sets to allow for new relationships to emerge. The absolute essence of design of reconfiguration, design is reconfiguration. And Jonah was using the term rule sets somewhat technically, but we can of course expand it out. Rule sets are not merely technical, they are norms too, so social norms, expectations, so we can actually think about that. So altering established rule sets, that was one strategic proposition. Creating openness, increased opportunities for risk and play, that's that level. Increasing the proliferation of ways of connecting demands that new relationships emerge. That's one of the third of Jonah's major propositions. And the one I already gave you, amplified metaphors, deconstruct expected norms. So let me bring stormy cold. And then he went, fourthly, the idea which a lot of you in D&T will be very familiar with, the idea of critical work as interference with what is, with the aim of making you think. But we'll see actually a lot of critical work is basically supplementing, extension beyond limits that goes beyond norms. There's plenty of free seats up here if people want to sit on chairs. Uncovering, which means revealing, which I think is extremely important, revealing previously obscured truth. And hacking, which we can also understand not just literally in terms of how we now think about it, but transfiguring, redisposing to think otherwise, redirecting. So these, and I think these criteria from Jonah were really interesting because they point to 2 things, to simultaneously critical and what I will call post-critical nature of the practices that it's involved with. So they are critical, strategic, and a form of practice which is once at the same time critical and transformative. And I think that's extremely important. I think to some extent the critical in part belongs to the 20th century. I think we're kind of moving into the point where the question of the transformative becomes extremely important here. So this is what we're doing. Really across the rest of the lectures we're looking at transformative practices. Today we're looking at the critical, more or less, and then at the end we'll look as to why we've got to go beyond the critical to acting otherwise. This is the lecture from Carl, and then Lisa Grocot's lecture on scenarios, Ezio on transformative practices, and then we'll... Now, let's start though again. We kind of got to, if the critical is the way, once we start to look at and think about the critical, it becomes to some extent obvious as to why we should have it. And yet, if we look at design historically, we look at design education, we look at design practices, the critical in design is almost an oxymoron. Why is that? It means, I think there are actually reasons for this. They're not just, it's not just a sort of fact of nature or something. There are structural reasons, and that means one has to think these structural reasons. 4 factors are, I think, important. First of all, design as trade and its limits. Design as service, too narrowly conceived. design without mind, and design without the social or the political. The way that these four are all, the last two are absences, and the first two are kind of forms of restriction. And I call these designs confinements, means that they work to confine design. Trade tends to confine design to a subaltern secondary status, and Jan van Turen really gets at this. We'll see this in a second. Service, narrowly thought, confines the kind of gifts that design can offer to persons. Or very often you hear, or you used to hear, designers talk about just doing the project. Not the project for someone, but doing the project, as if that the service was, if you like, to the project, not to whom it was addressed. Mind's limits. Design's thought, kind of confining itself to redundancy because it refuses to know itself and its capacities. That's why the rest of the academy is not interested in design. Or the way that, we'll also see in a second, the way that actually the cultural world wants to pretend that design is without mind. And then finally, of course, without the social, which deprives design of its context and its worth. Describes it of the four concepts which I think are needed, which can permit design to work across the world. The universal, the situation, the possible, and the measuring stage. There's also four cultural inhibitors of design as a cultural practice, and you'll see, just as a conceit, since I started with four, I've just gone on with fours. Everything's fours. Just as a way of doing it. Four cultural inhibitors of design as a cultural practice. Inhibitors concerning assumptions about technology, social sciences, and the aesthetics, all of which work to make it difficult to see design as a cultural practice. One, the cultural prejudice that everyday things are thought of only as means, they do not deal with ends. Arthur Danto, who is my favourite philosophical whipping boy here, who insists that only artworks deal with human ends. Artifacts just deal with means, their use just is their meaning, they don't really have any ontological reference. This is bullshit, of course, but it's absolutely dominant. And it's still why art has this extraordinary status that it does, and particularly in the United States. In fact, art has a unique status in the United States as a sort of place of culture. And therefore, by contrast, everything which is not art has no reference to ontology. It's nonsense. The denial of reflection, very important. We talked about this earlier on, but I want to sort of remind you that how much technology works because it does not critically reflect upon itself. Heidegger, this great line here, technology is the highest form of rational consciousness, and lack of reflection belong together. They are the same thing. They need not necessarily be, but Heidegger's point is, as we see modern technology in its overall form, especially its power there. Thirdly, we've dealt with this too. The problem of the social scientific definition of critique as a critical per se, as saying no or as negation, which leads the social sciences to the inability to see affirmation as also critique. And it lets design too kind of doesn't see this, it just sees itself as affirming without being critical at the same time. It doesn't see the critical force contained in possibility. It doesn't historically. I think we're starting to. And fourthly, the denial that things think, and especially the denial that the configuration of things think. Now this is related to Simon's understanding argument, that one future for design is for understanding. That's a statement we've gone through. But I also want to look at this to have a little excursus for the moment, and just kind of look back at this notion of how actually designs do think and how mind gets into design. So I'm taking a slight excursion from the logic here, but you'll see how it links up. If any of you have read Roland Barthes' remarkable little essay called Camera Lucida, it is at once one of the best, greatest essays ever written on photography, and it's the one with probably the greatest number of mistakes in it. It is wrong, almost from beginning to end. Yet it's an extraordinary piece of writing. One place that Barthes is wrong on is this photograph. He refers to it twice in the text. He refers to it as a photograph which vaguely interests it. A photographer called Karen Wessig, a Dutchman. It deals with the situation in Nicaragua about 1976 when there's a civil war, the Sandinistas versus the Somoza National Guard. And what he's referring to here, Wessig, is the sort of the coexistence of the nuns, the church, going about its business, social if you like, and social services business, let us call it, on one angle, and the soldiers on the other. Barthes says to himself, but is this conjunction intentional, and does it lead me to further reflection? And he says, no, it is not intentional. It happened by accident. Wessing just happened to be there, and he photographed. Now, anybody who is a photographer will know that no such conjunctions happen like that, or rather, by the time you have photographed, decided which you will actually print from your sheet, by the time you have published it and got it published, by the time somebody's made the decision that it's worth publishing, there is nothing intentional about it at all. It is, of course, a construct. We know it's a construct. But what Barthes was referring to is two old prejudices. One, that something like a photograph, that the visual configuration itself could not be intentional and therefore could not lead to further meaning. And secondly, an argument there is that things like photographs and by extension the visual cannot show us structures of cause and effect. Arnheim, who is a great, written many books about art and design, including books about composition, which should have made him in some ways know that, writes, look, he says, looking at a similar picture of a murder, he says, no verbal description can match the impact of a scene, or a photographic scene of the death. But pictures cannot tell us whether we were witnessing an act of wanton murder or justified punishment. This is so because images are taken out of context of cause and effect, which would tell us what events led to the present scene, what consequences it will have, and what else is going on at the same time. Sounds superficially accurate. And in many ways, in certain ways, it is accurate, but it is not the truth. What Arnheim is saying is, what pictures can do, above all, is show visual presence. He is one of the greatest. One of Rembrandt's late self-portraits, the one from Enwood House, one of the great pictures of the world. Physical presence, that's what art shows, like nothing else. By contrast, he said, look what happens when an artist tries to paint words. This is Delacroix's picture at right of Hamlet and Horatio standing at the grave side. This is Hamlet. They're speaking to the grave digger while he is digging the grave for Ophelia, who is committed suicide, and the grave digger is discoursing on a skull that he has turned up, which is that of the jester Yorick, who Hamlet knew. And Arnheim says this: in that scene, Shakespeare displays a whole range of his brilliance, as Hamlet argued about suicide, about the chilling anonymity of the skull against the politician, and the courtier, the lawyer to whom it may have belonged, and the tender humanity of the jester Yorick to whom it did belong. He muses on the heroic greatness of the conqueror Alexander coming to dust. When from this firework of spirited wit we go to Delacroix's painting, Arnheim says, we may be tempted unfairly to compare the picture with the play, and complain that the painter gives us none of these precious thoughts, but merely the physical scene of the prince and his friend standing there by the grave. And indeed, he's right. Later on in the same article, he refers to another little, slightly previous scene at the graveyard, where the gravedigger himself reflects brilliantly, in Shakespeare's language, on the difference between drowning oneself and being drowned. And this is Arnheim's reflection on that scene. It's just the absolute previous one in the play. Instead of a single scene, we are given two. They meet in a conceptual space in which they form a coordinated double image. The two scenes are sharply reduced to relevant items, characterized by their opposite actions, and from this symmetrical display of two rarefied plots, that is, suicide and drowning, derives the verdict. I won't go into it's unfortunate we don't have time to go into the detail, but just try and keep that now. And then what Arnheim says is, this is what verbal language can do, and only verbal language. The visual, he says, cannot do this. Now, look at these next three photographs. 1937, Life magazine sends Margaret Bourke-White, the photographer, to the Ohio River Valley, where the Ohio River has overflown its bank. This is Louisville, Kentucky. And she goes around and photographs in the town scenes of flooding. At one point, she comes across an advertisement, you can see it here, laterally down the side of the building. And she films a line of people, she photographs a line